The high school reunion invitation lay on the kitchen counter, the corners slightly curled from the humidity in Margaret's small house. The glossy cardstock, embossed with her graduating class year, seemed to taunt her every time she walked past it. Margaret had stared at it for days, flipping it over in her hands, reading the familiar names listed on the planning committee. None of them stirred anything in her. None, except for one name she couldn't bring herself to look for, Peter. She hadn't thought about Peter in years, or so she told herself. But the truth was more complicated. His memory lingered in the back of her mind like an old photograph tucked in a drawer, forgotten until the moment she stumbled across it. They had been inseparable once, two young souls caught in the whirlwind of first love. But that was a lifetime ago, another world entirely. Now, at 56, Margaret was a different woman. A wife, a mother, a grandmother. There was no room for youthful dreams in her life anymore. Still, the idea of seeing him again sent a shiver through her, both thrilling and terrifying. What would he look like now? Would he still have that easy smile, the one that could undo her with a single glance? Would he remember the promises they'd made under the bleachers, promises that had dissolved the moment her parents intervened and sent her away to college in another state? Margaret's husband, Tom, shuffled into the kitchen, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose as he flipped through the morning paper. He didn't notice the way she quickly pushed the invitation under a stack of mail. Tom was a good man, steady and dependable, if a little dull. They had built a solid life together, raising 2 children and navigating the ups and downs of a long marriage. But the spark they once had, if it had ever been there, had long since faded into the routine of shared responsibilities and quiet evenings in front of the television. "Anything interesting in the mail?" Tom asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "No, just bills," Margaret replied quickly, forcing a smile. "The usual." Tom grunted in acknowledgement, his attention already back on the sports section. Margaret's chest tightened as she watched him, guilt pooling in her stomach. She hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't even made up her mind about going to the reunion, but the thought of Peter made her feel as though she'd betrayed Tom in some unspoken way. The days passed in a haze of indecision. Margaret busied herself with errands and chores, trying to push the invitation and the memories it stirred out of her mind. But the closer the date drew, the more restless she became. One evening, after Tom had gone to bed, she found herself sitting at the kitchen table with the invitation in front of her. The words "Class of '86 Reunion" gleamed under the dim light, and before she could second-guess herself, Margaret picked up her phone and RSVP'd. The reunion was held in the ballroom of a downtown hotel, a far cry from the modest gymnasium where they'd celebrated their high school graduation. Margaret arrived early, her nerves jangling as she stepped through the revolving doors. She'd chosen a simple black dress, elegant but understated, and had spent more time than she cared to admit styling her graying hair into soft waves. She told herself it didn't matter what she looked like. This was just an innocent trip down memory lane. But deep down, she wanted to be seen. She wanted Peter to see her. The room was already buzzing with activity when she walked in, the air thick with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Familiar faces, older and softened by time, greeted her with surprised smiles and warm hugs. Margaret moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries and catching up with old friends. But her eyes kept scanning the room, searching for one face among the many. And then she saw him. Peter stood near the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand and that same boyish grin on his lips. His hair was thinner, streaked with silver, but his eyes were just as bright as she remembered. He caught her gaze across the room, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat as he set down his glass and started toward her. "Margaret," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "I can't believe it's you." She managed a smile, though her heart was pounding. "Hello, Peter. It's been a long time." "It has," he agreed, his eyes searching hers. "You look amazing." Margaret blushed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Thank you. You look good too." They fell into conversation easily, the years between them fading as they reminisced about their school days. Peter told her about his career in architecture, his travels, his children. Margaret shared stories of her own family, carefully omitting the cracks in her marriage. They laughed about old pranks and shared memories, their connection as effortless as it had been all those years ago. As the night wore on, Peter's tone grew quieter, more serious. "I always wondered about you, he said, his gaze steady. "What happened after you left?" Margaret hesitated, her fingers tightening around her glass. "Life happened, I guess. My parents didn't give me much choice back then." Peter nodded, his expression somber. I tried to reach out, but your letters stopped coming. I thought, maybe you'd moved on. I thought you had, Margaret admitted. The words felt heavy on her tongue, weighted with years of unspoken regret. They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the room fading into the background. Peter reached for her hand, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her. Can we talk somewhere quieter? He asked softly. Margaret hesitated, her mind racing. This was dangerous territory, and she knew it. But the pull of Peter's presence was undeniable, a magnetic force she couldn't resist. She nodded, letting him lead her toward a small terrace overlooking the city. The cool night air was a welcome relief as they stepped outside. The city lights glittered like stars, casting a soft glow over their faces. Peter leaned against the railing, his hands gripping the metal as if anchoring himself. I don't want to complicate your life, he began, his voice low. But I need to tell you. I never stopped thinking about you. Margaret felt her chest tighten, a mix of longing and guilt swirling inside her. Peter, he cut her off, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. I know you're married. I know this isn't fair. But being here tonight, seeing you again, it feels like fate. Margaret looked away, her heart pounding. She thought of Tom, of their life together, of the vows they'd made. But she also thought of the spark she'd felt with Peter, the way he made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Peter stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. Just tell me what you're feeling. Margaret hesitated, the weight of her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She didn't know what she was feeling, only that she was caught between two worlds, unable to fully belong to either. Margaret's breath hitched as Peter's lips pressed against hers, firm yet tender, igniting a fire she hadn't felt in decades. The kiss deepened, her hands moving instinctively to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. Peter's hands slid around her waist, pulling her closer until their bodies were pressed together in a way that felt both unfamiliar and desperately right. She knew this was dangerous, that every second she let this continue was a step further into a forbidden world. But the weight of responsibility, of loyalty, of guilt, everything that had kept her tethered to her life for so long, seemed to dissolve in his arms. Peter broke the kiss first, resting his forehead against hers as they both caught their breath. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. I've wanted this. I've wanted you. For so long. Margaret couldn't answer. Words felt too small, too inadequate to convey the storm raging inside her. Instead, she let her hands trail up to his face, her fingers tracing the lines etched by time. His eyes searched hers, asking a question she couldn't bring herself to refuse. He kissed her again, more urgently this time, and Margaret felt herself giving in completely. Her body responded to his, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. When Peter's hands moved to the small of her back, pulling her even closer, Margaret gasped softly against his lips. We shouldn't, she murmured, but the words lacked conviction. Her body betrayed her, leaning into him, craving the warmth and connection she hadn't felt in years. Tell me to stop, Peter whispered, his breath hot against her ear. If you want me to stop, I will. Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she kissed him again, her fingers threading through his hair as she gave herself over to the moment. The cool night air seemed to fade, replaced by the heat building between them. Peter's hands roamed her back, firm and steady, while his lips trailed down her jawline to her neck, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. Come with me, he said, his voice low and filled with need. His eyes met hers, the intensity in his gaze making her pulse quicken. We can't do this here. Margaret hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. But the thought of walking away, of returning to her life as if nothing had happened, felt unbearable. Her resolve crumbled as she nodded, allowing Peter to take her hand and lead her back through the hotel. They walked quickly, avoiding eye contact with the other reunion attendees as they made their way to the elevators. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of fear and anticipation coursing through her. When the elevator doors closed behind them, the tension between them snapped. Peter pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a hunger that left her breathless. By the time they reached his room, Margaret's reservations had all but vanished. Peter closed the door behind them, his hands on her waist as he guided her toward the bed. She could feel her own nerves trembling beneath the surface, but the way he looked at her, like she was the only woman in the world, made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. Peter paused, his hands resting gently on her hips as he searched her face. Are you sure about this? He asked softly. Margaret swallowed hard, her throat dry. She should say no. She should stop this before it went any further. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded, reaching up to kiss him again, her fingers curling into his shirt as she pulled him closer. The kiss deepened, and soon his hands were sliding down her back, exploring her with a reverence that made her shiver. Margaret felt her inhibitions slipping away as she let herself get lost in the moment, her body responding to his touch with a desperation she hadn't realized she possessed. Peter guided her gently onto the bed, his lips never leaving hers as he followed her down. His hands moved over her body with a confidence that sent sparks coursing through her, awakening sensations she'd thought were long buried. Margaret's own hands roamed his shoulders, his back, memorizing the feel of him. Their clothes fell away piece by piece, each article removed with a mix of urgency and care. Peter's kisses trailed over her skin, each touch igniting a fire that burned away the last remnants of doubt. Margaret closed her eyes, letting herself be swept away by the sensation, the intimacy, the sheer exhilaration of being wanted so completely. When they came together, it was with a passion that left them both breathless. The connection between them felt raw, electric, and utterly undeniable. Margaret clung to Peter, her nails digging into his back as he moved with her, their bodies fitting together like they were meant to. Each kiss, each touch, each whispered word was a reminder of the fire that still burned within her, a fire she had almost forgotten existed. Time seemed to blur as they lost themselves in each other, the outside world fading into oblivion. For those moments, nothing else mattered, no obligations, no consequences, no guilt. There was only the two of them, reclaiming a love they thought had been lost forever. As the night wore on and their passion subsided into quiet intimacy, Margaret lay in Peter's arms, her head resting on his chest as his fingers traced lazy circles on her back. The reality of what had happened began to settle over her, bringing with it a wave of conflicting emotions. She felt exhilarated, alive, but also deeply conflicted. "I don't know what this means," she said softly, breaking the silence. Peter tightened his hold on her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "It means that some things are too strong to fade," he replied. "Even after all these years." Margaret closed her eyes, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She wanted to believe him, to cling to the idea that this night could be more than just a fleeting moment. But deep down, she knew the complications waiting for her outside this room, the life she'd built, the promises she'd made. "We can't stay here forever," she said quietly, her voice tinged with sadness. "I know," Peter replied. He tilted her chin to meet his gaze, his expression tender but resolute. "But that doesn't mean this has to end." Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat as she tried to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. For now, she decided she would let herself stay in this moment a little longer, savoring the connection she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own reckoning. But tonight, Margaret allowed herself to feel, to want, to remember what it meant to be desired. And for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. The room was quiet except for the sound of their steady breathing. Margaret lay still, cocooned in the warmth of Peter's embrace, her mind a swirl of emotions she couldn't quite pin down. The weight of her choices pressed against her chest, but the memory of his touch, his voice, his presence, those things felt so undeniable, so painfully real. Peter ran his fingers through her hair, his touch gentle and soothing. "I don't want this to be the last time," he murmured, his voice low and intimate. "I can't imagine letting you walk out that door and back into a life where I don't exist." Margaret closed her eyes, her heart aching at his words. "Peter," she began, her voice trembling, "I don't even know what this is. I don't know what it can be." "It's us," he replied simply. "It's what we've always had. It never went away, Margaret. You know that." The conviction in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. She wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to the idea that this connection, this spark, could be more than a fleeting moment. But the realities of her life loomed large, impossible to ignore. "I have a husband," she said quietly, the words feeling heavier than ever before. "A family. A life I've built over decades." Peter's hand stilled against her hair. "And are you happy in that life?" he asked gently, his tone free of judgment but laced with curiosity. Margaret hesitated. The truth was a thorn she had avoided for years. She cared for Tom, respected him, but happiness? That was a word she hadn't dared to apply to her marriage in a long time. "I don't know," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I've asked myself that question in years." Peter tilted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Then maybe it's time you did," he said softly. "I'm not asking you to make a decision tonight. I just want you to think about what you want, what you deserve." The intensity in his eyes was almost too much to bear. Margaret pulled away slightly, sitting up and wrapping the sheet around herself as she stared out the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a stark contrast to the darkness creeping into her thoughts. "I don't even know who I am anymore," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of her confession. "I've spent so long being someone's wife, someone's mother. I don't know what's left of me." Peter sat up beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back. "You're still the woman I fell in love with," he said, his voice steady. "And you deserve to find yourself again, whether that's with me or not." His words hung in the air, their honesty cutting through the fog in Margaret's mind. She turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face for answers she wasn't sure she wanted to find. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small. Peter hesitated, his own uncertainty evident. "That's up to you," he said finally. "But I'm here. Whatever you decide, I'm here." Margaret nodded, though her thoughts were far from settled. She wanted to believe in the possibility of something more, something better, but the path forward felt impossibly unclear. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. Margaret woke to the sensation of Peter's arm draped over her waist, his body warm and steady beside her. For a moment she allowed herself to linger in the quiet intimacy, the weight of reality temporarily suspended. But as the memories of the previous night flooded back, guilt began to creep in. She slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake Peter, and dressed quickly. Her reflection in the mirror caught her attention, and she stared at the woman looking back at her, a woman she barely recognized. When Peter stirred, his voice was soft and groggy. "You're leaving." Margaret turned to face him, her heart twisting at the sight of him sitting up, the sheets pooled around his waist. "I have to," she said quietly. "I need time to think." Peter nodded, his expression tinged with sadness but also understanding. "Take all the time you need," he said. "Just promise me you'll be honest with yourself." Margaret didn't reply. Instead, she picked up her bag and walked to the door, her steps heavy with the weight of her choices. She paused for a moment, glancing back at Peter, who watched her with an expression that made her chest ache. "Goodbye, Peter," she said softly, and then she was gone. The drive home was a blur. Margaret's mind raced with thoughts she couldn't seem to quiet, the memory of Peter's touch still fresh against her skin. When she pulled into her driveway, the sight of her house, a symbol of the life she'd built, felt both comforting and suffocating. Tom was in the kitchen when she walked in, sipping his morning coffee and reading the paper. He looked up and smiled when he saw her, his expression warm and familiar. "You're up early," he said, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. Margaret forced a smile, her heart heavy with guilt. "Couldn't sleep," she lied, setting her bag down on the counter. Tom nodded, his attention already drifting back to the sports section. Margaret watched him for a moment, her chest tightening as the distance between them became painfully apparent. She knew she couldn't go on like this, not with the weight of her choices pressing down on her. Something had to change. But whether that meant confronting Tom, ending things with Peter, or finding a way to reconcile the two parts of her life, Margaret didn't know. For now, all she could do was breathe and take the first step forward, whatever that step might be. Margaret moved through the following days like a shadow of herself. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock in the living room and the hum of the refrigerator. Tom, as always, was predictable in his habits, working in the garage, watching his favorite shows, or reading the paper. He noticed her quietness but didn't press her, and Margaret wasn't sure if that made things better or worse. She wanted to talk to him, to confess everything, but every time she tried, the words caught in her throat. Peter's absence was equally deafening. She hadn't reached out to him, afraid that doing so would only deepen the fracture in her already fragile world. Yet she couldn't stop replaying their moments together, the passion, the connection, the way he made her feel truly seen. It haunted her, a bittersweet ache that refused to fade. Late one evening, after Tom had gone to bed, Margaret found herself sitting in the living room with a glass of wine in hand. She stared at the photo on the mantel, a family portrait taken years ago, with her and Tom smiling beside their two children. They looked so happy, so complete. But the woman in the photo didn't feel like her anymore. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't hear her phone buzz. When she glanced down, her heart skipped a beat. It was a message from Peter. "I miss you. I'm here if you want to talk." Margaret stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the reply button. Part of her longed to respond, to give in to the pull that had drawn them together. But another part of her, a quieter, steadier part, reminded her of the life she had built, the promises she had made. She set the phone down without replying, her heart heavy. The next morning, Margaret decided to take action. She couldn't keep living in limbo, torn between two worlds. She needed clarity, even if it meant confronting the truths she'd been avoiding. She started with Peter. Driving to the cafe where they'd agreed to meet, Margaret felt a mix of anticipation and dread. Peter was already there when she arrived, seated at a corner table with his coffee in hand. His face lit up when he saw her, and for a moment, she felt the pull of his presence all over again. "Margaret," he said, standing to greet her. "Hi," she replied, her voice soft. She sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Peter studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You didn't respond to my message," he said gently. "I know," she admitted. "I needed time to think." "And have you?" he asked, his tone cautious. Margaret nodded, her chest tightening. "Peter, what we have, it's real. I know that, but I also know I can't keep doing this. I can't keep tearing myself in two." Peter's face fell, but he nodded. "I understand," he said quietly. "I don't want to make this harder for you." "You've done nothing wrong," Margaret said, reaching for his hand. "You reminded me of something I'd forgotten, what it feels like to be alive, to be seen. I'll always be grateful for that." "But it's not enough," Peter said, his voice heavy with resignation. Margaret hesitated, tears pricking at her eyes. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I need to find that answer for myself. I need to figure out who I am before I can give myself to anyone." Peter looked at her for a long moment, his hand tightening around hers. "You deserve to be happy, Margaret. Whatever that looks like." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. When she finally pulled her hand away, the loss felt like a physical ache. When Margaret returned home, she knew the next step would be even harder. Tom was sitting in the living room, watching one of his favorite shows. He looked up when she walked in, his expression warm but distracted. "Hey, everything okay?" he asked, his tone casual. Margaret stood in the doorway, her heart pounding. "Tom, can we talk?" He muted the television, his brow furrowing in concern. "Of course. What's going on?" Margaret sat down beside him, her hands trembling in her lap. "I need to be honest with you," she began. "About everything." Tom's expression shifted, a mixture of confusion and worry. "Okay," he said slowly. "What do you mean?" Margaret took a deep breath, the weight of her confession pressing down on her. "I've been feeling lost, Tom, for a long time. And recently, I crossed a line I shouldn't have." Tom's eyes widened, and for a moment he said nothing. "What kind of line?" he asked, his voice strained. "I reconnected with someone from my past," Margaret admitted, her voice shaking. "And it went too far. I let it go too far." The silence that followed was deafening. Tom stared at her, his face pale, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. "You're telling me you cheated?" he asked, his voice low. Margaret nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't plan for it. But yes." Tom stood abruptly, pacing the room as he ran a hand through his hair. "Why?" he demanded. "After everything we've been through, why would you do this?" "I don't have an easy answer," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been feeling disconnected, like I've been living someone else's life. But that's not an excuse. I'm not trying to justify what I did. I needed to tell you the truth." Tom stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping as he turned to face her. "Do you still love me?" he asked, his voice breaking. Margaret's heart shattered at the question. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I want to. But I don't even know who I am anymore, Tom. I need to figure that out." Tom sank into the armchair, his head in his hands. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. "I don't know how to fix this." "Maybe we can't fix it," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "But I think we owe it to ourselves to try. If you're willing." Tom looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but steady. "I don't want to lose you, Margaret. But I don't know if I can trust you again." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand, and I'll do whatever it takes to rebuild that trust. But I can't make you stay." Tom was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "Let's take it one day at a time," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "That's all we can do." Margaret nodded, relief and sorrow mingling in her chest. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning, a fragile thread of hope to hold on to. As they sat together in the quiet house, Margaret felt the weight of her choices settle over her. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years she felt a glimmer of clarity. She didn't have all the answers, but she was ready to start searching for herself, for her happiness, and for whatever the future might hold. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act. Margaret and Tom existed in a fragile truce, navigating the unspoken tension that now permeated their home. Conversations were polite but strained, their once familiar routines feeling awkward and foreign. At night, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts cycling between guilt, regret, and the faint hope that something new could emerge from the wreckage of their marriage. Tom, for his part, seemed to alternate between anger and sadness. Some days he barely spoke, retreating to the garage or the backyard to busy himself with projects. Other days, he approached Margaret with cautious attempts at connection, offering to help with dinner, suggesting they watch a movie together. She accepted his gestures with gratitude, knowing they were small but significant steps toward rebuilding their trust. Despite their efforts, the ghost of Peter lingered in Margaret's mind. She hadn't contacted him since their meeting at the cafe, and he hadn't reached out to her, respecting her need for space. But his absence was a presence in itself, a constant reminder of the passion and connection she had felt with him. It would have been easy to fall back into his arms, to escape the messiness of her marriage for the simplicity of a love that felt so effortless. But Margaret knew that path would only lead to more heartbreak for everyone involved. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Tom broke the silence. "Margaret," he began, his voice hesitant, "I've been thinking. Maybe we should talk to someone. A counselor or therapist. Someone who can help us figure this out." Margaret looked at him, surprised by the suggestion. Tom had always been a man of few words, reluctant to share his emotions, let alone seek professional help. The fact that he was willing to take this step spoke volumes about his commitment to their marriage. "I think that's a good idea," she said softly. "I want to figure this out too." Their first counseling session was uncomfortable but necessary. Sitting across from a calm, empathetic therapist, Margaret and Tom began to unpack the years of distance and miscommunication that had led them to this point. Margaret admitted to feeling invisible and unfulfilled, while Tom confessed that he had taken her for granted, assuming their marriage would always run on autopilot. It was painful to confront their shortcomings, but it was also a relief to finally speak the truths they had been avoiding for so long. Over time, the sessions became a safe space for both of them to express their fears and hopes. Margaret began to see Tom in a new light, not just as her husband, but as a man who was struggling with his own insecurities and desires. Likewise, Tom started to understand Margaret's need for connection and individuality, realizing that her affair had been a symptom of deeper issues rather than a betrayal born of malice. Through therapy, they worked on rebuilding their intimacy, both emotional and physical. It was a slow process fraught with setbacks and doubts, but each small victory, whether it was a meaningful conversation or a shared laugh, felt like a step toward healing. Months later, Margaret found herself sitting alone on the back porch, a cup of tea warming her hands as she watched the sun set over the horizon. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves, and the golden light bathed the yard in a soft, nostalgic glow. She thought about everything that had happened, the choices she'd made, the pain she'd caused, the lessons she'd learned. She didn't regret her time with Peter. It had been a turning point, a moment that forced her to confront the parts of herself she had neglected for too long. But it had also been a reminder that passion alone wasn't enough to sustain a life. True fulfillment came from facing the complexities of love, from choosing to stay and fight for something worth saving. Tom stepped onto the porch, a beer in hand, and sat down beside her. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the unspoken tension that had once filled the space between them now replaced by a quiet sense of understanding. "You've been quiet today," he said finally, his tone gentle. "Just thinking," Margaret replied, glancing at him with a small smile. "About how far we've come." Tom nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know it hasn't been easy," he said, "but I'm glad we're still here. Together." "Me too," Margaret said, her voice steady. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Thank you for staying. For fighting for us." Tom looked at her, his eyes softening. "You're worth fighting for," he said simply. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest, a quiet but profound sense of peace. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, she felt hopeful about the future. They had faced the storm together, and while the scars would remain, they were a testament to their resilience and their love. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in twilight, Margaret leaned her head against Tom's shoulder. The past was still a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She was ready to embrace the present, to build something new and meaningful with the man who had stood by her side through it all. And for the first time in a long time, she felt truly whole.